The studio lights were too bright for a moment like this, and yet they felt dim compared to the weight pressing down on Keanu Reeves as he sat in the high-backed chair, fingers loosely interlaced, eyes lowered not in fear, but in something heavier: recognition. Across from him, Sandra Bullock waited with a patience that was almost painful to watch. It was the kind of patience formed by years of restraint, of swallowed words, of choosing grace even when honesty demanded to be spoken aloud. Cameras hummed softly, the audience held its breath, and somewhere between the scripted questions and the rehearsed smiles, a truth hovered, fragile, inevitable, and ready to fall. The host had asked something simple, something harmless by television standards, but it had cracked open a door Keanu had spent decades keeping closed. "When you look back," the host said, voice gentle, "is there a moment you wish you'd handled differently?" The question should have been easy. It wasn't. Keanu's jaw tightened, and in that silence, something ancient stirred. The room didn't know it yet, but the story unfolding wasn't about romance or regret in the way gossip columns preferred. It was about respect, earned, lost, and reclaimed. It was about how kindness can become a shield and a prison at the same time. Keanu lifted his gaze, not to the host, but to Sandra. The audience followed his eyes, sensing instinctively that whatever came next belonged to them both. Sandra's expression was composed, professional, but the tremor in her breath betrayed a deeper truth. This was not a reunion staged for nostalgia. This was not a carefully curated segment meant to trend online. This was a reckoning. Years earlier, long before the studio lights and the careful choreography of public life, Keanu had learned how easily people misunderstood quietness. In Hollywood, silence was often mistaken for indifference, humility for weakness. He had built a life around not correcting those assumptions, believing that dignity didn't need defense. But there were costs to that philosophy, costs paid by people who stood close enough to feel the consequences. Sandra had been one of them. Their bond, rooted in mutual respect and an unspoken understanding, had survived distance, rumors, and time, yet it had also been shaped by moments where Keanu chose restraint over clarity. The world applauded his gentleness. Sandra lived with the unanswered questions. The host tried to fill the quiet with a laugh, but it fell flat. Keanu's silence wasn't awkward, it was deliberate. He inhaled slowly, as if bracing himself against a tide. "There are moments," he began, voice low, steady, "when doing the kind thing feels easier than doing the honest thing." A ripple moved through the audience. Sandra's eyes softened, not in relief, but in recognition. She had lived inside that sentence for years. Keanu continued, choosing each word with care. "And sometimes kindness without honesty can hurt the people you care about most." The words were not an apology, not yet, but they were closer to truth than Keanu had ever allowed himself to speak publicly. The camera cut briefly to Sandra, catching the way her hands tightened together, the way she held herself upright, as if steadiness itself were an act of courage. Viewers at home would later replay this moment, analyzing expressions, pausing frames, speculating about what was left unsaid. But in that room, speculation didn't matter. What mattered was the human cost of silence. Keanu's mind drifted backward, to a time when his life felt simpler, before grief had carved its permanent lines into his worldview. He remembered how Sandra had laughed on set, unguarded, how she had challenged him not with confrontation, but with curiosity. She had seen him, not the icon, not the myth, but the man trying to navigate a world that rewarded loudness over depth. And when rumors began, when expectations pressed in from every side, Keanu retreated into what he knew best: restraint. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself silence was safer. He never asked if that silence felt like abandonment to the person standing beside him. Back in the present, the host gently asked, "Was there someone in particular you were thinking of?" The question hovered like a match near dry leaves. Keanu could have deflected. He could have smiled, offered a vague answer, preserved the comfort of ambiguity. The industry would have applauded his discretion. But something had shifted. He looked at Sandra again, and for the first time that night, he didn't look away. "Yes," he said. One word, heavy as a confession. Sandra exhaled, slow and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but the honesty in it cut through the room. "I think people assume silence means peace, but sometimes it just means someone is carrying the weight alone." There was no accusation in her tone, no bitterness. That was what was devastating. The audience didn't cheer, they didn't gasp, they listened. In that moment, the story transcended celebrity. It became familiar, achingly human. How many people watching had chosen quiet over clarity, believing it was kinder? How many had been hurt by someone else's silence? The host stepped back, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was a conversation that had waited too long to happen. Keanu nodded, absorbing Sandra's words with the humility that had defined his public life, but now took on a sharper edge. "You're right," he said, "and I'm still learning that truth doesn't cancel kindness, it completes it." As the cameras rolled, viewers saw something rare, a man known for composure, allowing vulnerability to surface without theatrics. Keanu wasn't performing remorse, he was acknowledging growth that came late, but honestly. Sandra met Keanu's gaze, and for a fleeting second, the years between them seemed to collapse. There was no promise of reconciliation, no dramatic declaration. That wasn't the point. The point was respect, restored not through grand gestures, but through the courage to speak plainly. But beneath this exchange lay another presence, quieter but no less significant. Alexandra Grant. Her name was not spoken, but her influence lingered in the way Keanu framed his words, in the way he emphasized growth and accountability. Alexandra had challenged him in private to examine his patterns, to understand that humility should never excuse avoidance. Her belief in honest dialogue had brought him here, to this moment where truth felt necessary rather than optional. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the segment drew toward its close, but the emotional intensity did not recede. If anything, it deepened. The host thanked them both, voice subdued, aware that anything louder would feel disrespectful. Applause followed, tentative at first, then warm, not for entertainment, but for bravery. Keanu leaned back in his chair, shoulders relaxing as if he had set something down at last. Sandra smiled, not the polished smile of a seasoned actress, but a small, genuine one that acknowledged the courage it takes to be seen clearly. When the cameras finally cut, the room exhaled. Crew members moved quietly, instinctively aware that they had witnessed something intimate. Keanu stood, and for a moment, he and Sandra faced each other without an audience. "Thank you," he said, simply. Sandra nodded. "For listening," she replied. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something equally powerful, mutual respect reclaimed through honesty. Outside the studio, headlines would spin narratives, fans would choose sides, and social media would dissect every second, but the true impact of that moment would unfold more quietly, in living rooms and late-night reflections, where viewers recognized themselves in the story. They would remember the lesson embedded in Keanu's confession and Sandra's grace, that kindness without truth can wound, and truth delivered with respect can heal. As Keanu walked into the cool night air, he felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because something essential had begun. This was only the first step in a longer journey, one that would test his commitment to honesty, challenge his understanding of humility, and demand courage beyond silence. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and unexpected reckonings. But for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt ready to walk it openly, knowing that respect for himself and for others was not something to be implied, but something to be spoken aloud. The morning after the broadcast arrived without ceremony, yet for Keanu Reeves it carried a weight heavier than any premiere day or award night anticipation he had ever known. He woke before dawn, the city outside still wrapped in that fragile hush where street lights glow softer and the world seems momentarily undecided about beginning again. Sleep had not been restful. It had been filled with fragments of memory, moments replayed not as they truly happened, but as they might have unfolded had he chosen differently. The studio silence, Sandra's steady voice, the way his own words had finally left his mouth without a shield, all of it lingered like a truth that refused to settle quietly. For years, Keanu had believed that living gently meant avoiding collision, but now he understood that avoidance, too, left marks, often deeper and harder to heal. Public reaction arrived swiftly, as it always did, but this time it felt distant, almost irrelevant. Headlines tried to reduce complexity into clean narratives, fans debated meanings, and commentators speculated about motives, yet none of it touched the core of what Keanu felt stirring inside him. This was not about reputation or legacy, it was about accountability to the people whose lives had intersected with his in ways that silence had complicated. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, and allowed himself something he rarely did: stillness without distraction. In that quiet, he admitted a truth that had long made him uncomfortable. He had used humility as a refuge from confrontation, confusing gentleness with withdrawal, and in doing so, he had let others bear the emotional cost of his restraint. Across the city, Sandra Bullock began her own day with a similar sense of emotional residue. She had expected curiosity, maybe even discomfort, but she had not anticipated the strange relief that followed the broadcast. Speaking honestly had not reopened old wounds the way she feared. Instead, it had drained them of their quiet power. For years, Sandra had carried unanswered questions, not because she needed explanations, but because she needed acknowledgement. What she had offered on air was not a challenge or a demand, but a truth she had earned the right to speak. And now, as messages poured in from friends and colleagues who recognized themselves in that exchange, she realized how many people lived with the same unspoken weight, mistaking endurance for strength. The narrative forming in the public sphere suggested closure, but real life rarely honored such neat conclusions. Keanu understood this deeply as he replayed moments from his past, times when choosing silence felt noble, even righteous. He remembered walking away from conversations that demanded clarity because he believed time would soften misunderstandings. He had trusted that kindness alone could bridge gaps that honesty might widen. Yet the broadcast had illuminated a painful paradox. Silence does not pause consequences, it simply delays them until they return with greater force. That realization did not come with shame, but with responsibility. Growth, he was learning, did not require self-condemnation. It required the courage to act differently moving forward. Later that afternoon, Keanu found himself in a space he often visited when he needed grounding, a modest room lined with books and personal mementos rather than accolades. It was here that Alexandra Grant had once challenged him gently but firmly, asking why he believed honesty had to be loud to be harmful. Alexandra's presence in his life had been transformative, not because she demanded change, but because she invited reflection. She had listened without interruption, then asked questions that lingered long after the conversation ended. Truth doesn't have to be harsh, but it does have to be present. Those words echoed now with renewed clarity. Alexandra had never asked him to speak for the sake of spectacle. She had asked him to speak for the sake of respect. As evening approached, Keanu received a message from Sandra, simple, unembellished, and profoundly human. She thanked him for listening, not just on air, but in the years that followed, even when listening arrived late. The message did not reopen the past, it reframed it. It acknowledged growth without demanding restitution, and in doing so, it modeled the very grace the story now represented to millions. Keanu read it more than once, not searching for subtext, but absorbing its sincerity. This was not a return to what had been, it was an affirmation of what could exist when two people chose honesty without expectation. That night, Keanu stepped outside, the city alive with movement and noise, and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. The fear he once associated with speaking plainly had diminished, replaced by a quieter confidence rooted in alignment rather than approval. He understood now that respect was not preserved by absence, but by presence, by the willingness to show up even when words felt insufficient. The journey ahead would not be easy. Old habits rarely release their hold without resistance. Yet he sensed that this time the path forward was clearer, illuminated by the understanding that humility and truth were not opposites, but partners. In living rooms and late-night conversations around the world, viewers continued to revisit the exchange, finding in it reflections of their own unresolved silences. They spoke to partners, friends, and family members with a little more courage, a little less fear. That was the quiet power of the moment. It did not instruct, it invited. It reminded people that dignity is not diminished by honesty, and kindness reaches its fullest expression when paired with clarity. As the day ended, Keanu sat once more in stillness, but this time it felt different. The quiet no longer carried avoidance, it carried intention. He was not absolved, nor was he burdened by regret. He was simply present, aware that the most meaningful transformations rarely announce themselves loudly. They unfold in choices made when no one is watching, in conversations pursued rather than postponed, and in the steady commitment to honor others, not just with compassion, but with truth. And in that understanding, Keanu felt the beginning of something enduring, a resilience born not from silence, but from the courage to speak when it mattered most. In the weeks that followed, life did not slow for Keanu Reeves, yet something inside him had undeniably shifted. Meetings came and went, scripts were discussed, charitable commitments filled his calendar, and the world continued to treat him with the quiet reverence it always had. But beneath that familiar rhythm ran a new current of awareness. Every interaction now carried a question he could no longer ignore. Am I present, or am I hiding behind restraint? It was an uncomfortable lens through which to view his own behavior, yet it was also clarifying. Keanu began to notice how often people softened their truths around him, how frequently others deferred to his silence as if it were a final word rather than an invitation. For the first time, he understood that his quietness, however well-intentioned, had shaped rooms and relationships in ways he never consciously chose. One evening, alone in a small theater after a private screening, Keanu found himself watching not the film on the screen, but the empty seats around him. The absence felt symbolic. He thought of moments across his life where conversations had ended too soon, where clarity had been postponed because it felt safer to let time blur the edges. He had always believed patience healed most things, but patience without communication, he now realized, often became neglect dressed as virtue. That realization did not come with self-loathing, it came with responsibility. Growth demanded he stop romanticizing silence and start understanding its consequences. The man the world admired for his gentleness had to reconcile that gentleness with the courage to be direct. At the same time, Sandra Bullock was experiencing her own quiet reckoning. The public conversation had faded into background noise, but the personal impact lingered. She had spent years learning how to be resilient without becoming closed, how to protect herself without building walls so high that no one could reach her. Speaking openly had not weakened her the way she once feared. Instead, it had reminded her of a strength rooted in self-respect. Sandra realized that for a long time she had mistaken endurance for peace, believing that staying composed meant staying healed. Now she understood that healing sometimes required naming what hurt, even if it disrupted the calm she had worked so hard to maintain. The distance between Keanu and Sandra was no longer defined by unspoken tension, but by a shared understanding that neither sought to rewrite the past. Their exchanges, brief and sincere, reflected a maturity shaped by time and perspective. There was no attempt to reclaim what once was, only a mutual recognition that respect did not require proximity, only honesty. That understanding freed both of them from expectations that had quietly weighed on their connection for years. It allowed them to stand in their truth without needing validation from each other or the world watching from afar. Yet the most profound influence on Keanu's transformation remained largely unseen by the public. Alexandra Grant had never pushed him toward grand declarations or public confessions. Her impact lay in her consistency, in her refusal to accept emotional avoidance as humility. Alexandra believed deeply that love, in any form, demanded presence, and presence demanded honesty. In private conversations, she challenged Keanu not with accusation, but with clarity. She asked him why he believed silence was safer than truth, and whether avoiding discomfort truly aligned with the compassion he valued so deeply. Those questions lingered, reshaping how he understood his own identity. As days turned into weeks, Keanu began practicing a different way of being, one conversation at a time. He spoke more openly with collaborators, expressing uncertainty instead of masking it with detachment. He listened actively, not as a passive observer, but as someone willing to engage even when answers were imperfect. These were not dramatic changes visible to the outside world. They were subtle, almost invisible shifts that nonetheless altered the emotional landscape around him. People responded differently, leaning in rather than stepping back, sensing that his presence now invited honesty rather than silence. Still, growth was not linear. There were moments when old instincts resurfaced, when retreat felt easier than engagement. In those moments, Keanu felt the weight of his own patterns pressing against his resolve. He learned that courage was not a permanent state, but a repeated choice, one that required patience with himself as much as accountability. The discomfort he once avoided now served as a guide, signaling where growth was needed most. Each time he chose to stay present rather than withdraw, he felt a quiet reinforcement of a new truth taking root. The broader impact of that televised moment continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. Letters arrived from strangers who saw their own lives reflected in the exchange, from people who had been hurt by silence, or who had used silence as a shield. They spoke of conversations finally had, apologies finally offered, and boundaries finally respected. Keanu read many of these messages privately, humbled by the realization that vulnerability, when shared responsibly, could create space for healing far beyond its original context. The story had become larger than him, larger than Sandra, even larger than the narrative the public tried to impose. Late one night, standing at his window, Keanu reflected on the irony of it all. For years, he had believed that the most respectful thing he could do was to step back, to avoid imposing his truth on others. Now he understood that respect also meant trusting people with honesty, allowing them the dignity of responding to what is real rather than what is implied. Silence, he learned, was not inherently virtuous. It gained meaning only when chosen consciously and shared transparently. By the end of that season of reflection, Keanu felt neither redeemed nor burdened by his past. He felt grounded. He recognized that integrity was not about perfection, but alignment between values and actions. The truth he had once feared had not destroyed relationships or diminished kindness, it had refined them. And as he prepared for the conversations still ahead, he carried with him a deeper resilience, one forged not in avoidance, but in the willingness to face discomfort with humility and care. By the time the season changed, Keanu Reeves understood that the hardest part of transformation was not the public moment that announced it, but the private discipline required to sustain it. The world had moved on, as it always did, but he had not returned to the comfort of old habits. Instead, he found himself measuring his days by quieter standards, whether he had spoken clearly when clarity was needed, whether he had listened without preparing an escape, whether he had stayed present when discomfort tempted him to withdraw. These were not dramatic victories, and no audience applauded them, yet they carried a gravity he could feel in his body, a steadiness that came from living closer to his values. He realized that integrity was not something achieved once and admired forever. It was something practiced daily, often imperfectly, and always with intention. In this new rhythm, Keanu discovered a deeper meaning in humility, one that no longer required silence as its proof. He began to understand that humility could coexist with self-expression, that acknowledging his own perspective did not diminish others, but honored them by inviting honest exchange. Conversations that once felt risky now felt necessary, even restorative. He noticed how people responded when he spoke plainly without defensiveness, how trust grew not from grand assurances, but from consistency. Each honest interaction reinforced a simple truth he had once overlooked. Respect is built when people feel seen, not spared. Meanwhile, Sandra Bullock found herself reflecting on the unexpected peace that followed her decision to speak openly. The absence of unresolved tension did not erase the past, but it reframed it in a way that allowed her to move forward without carrying invisible weight. She no longer wondered whether her silence had been mistaken for acceptance, or whether her composure had concealed hurt too well. By naming her truth, she had reclaimed authorship of her own experience. That clarity did not bind her to Keanu's journey, nor did it distance her from it. Instead, it placed both of them on parallel paths defined by mutual respect rather than unfinished questions. Their interactions, when they occurred, were marked by ease rather than expectation. There was no need to revisit old narratives or defend choices made long ago. The honesty that had once felt overdue now served as a foundation sturdy enough to support distance without discomfort. In that sense, the resolution was not cinematic, but it was real. It reflected a maturity that recognized closure not as an ending, but as an agreement to move forward without denial or resentment. At the center of Keanu's continued growth remained Alexandra Grant, whose influence was never about correction, but about alignment. Alexandra believed the truth, when spoken with care, was an act of love, and that love required the courage to be known. Her presence reminded Keanu that vulnerability was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be exercised responsibly. Together, they navigated conversations that did not shy away from complexity, understanding that intimacy, whether romantic, creative, or human, thrived on openness rather than assumption. As months passed, Keanu noticed the broader implications of his choices extending beyond personal relationships into the way he engaged with the world. Acts of generosity felt more grounded, no longer shaped by the need to remain invisible. Advocacy became more intentional, guided by listening as much as by action. He understood now that true kindness was not passive, it was participatory. It asked for presence, for accountability, and for the willingness to speak when silence would be easier. The story that had begun under studio lights ultimately found its meaning far from them. It lived in conversations where people chose honesty over comfort, in moments where silence was replaced by understanding, and the quiet confidence that followed decisions aligned with one's values. Keanu did not emerge as a hero redeemed by confession, nor did Sandra become a symbol defined by vulnerability. They remained human, complex, evolving, and worthy of respect, not because of perfection, but because of their willingness to grow. In the end, the lesson was neither dramatic nor new, but it was enduring. Truth, when paired with humility, does not fracture relationships, it refines them. Silence, when chosen unconsciously, can wound, but when chosen with intention, it can also hold space. The difference lies in awareness. Keanu carried that awareness forward, not as a burden, but as a guide, knowing that the most meaningful legacies are not built in moments of spectacle, but in the daily practice of respect, resilience, and kindness.